Hey everyone, and welcome to this video reflection and welcome to your own home. My name is Michael, I'm from Brazil and I'm the pastor of Oslo International Church. And today's Sunday, when you're watching this, and this is when I would usually be welcoming many of you to our service at Bakkehauen Kirke in Oslo, Norway. But not today. Today is different. Because as you all know, we all need to do our part in helping to control the spread of the COVID-19 virus. And for OiC, this means that we're not meeting in person for a while. And keep updated on our social media to know what's coming up. And this means that today I'm here preaching to a camera, which is a bit weird and is a first for me. But I do know a lot of you folks who will listen to this, so I'll imagine you here as I speak this, and we'll see how this goes. And yeah, it's been only a few days since Thursday, since the Norwegian government declared a shutdown on schools and universities and a whole lot of other stuff, and we're supposed to work from home and do school at home and all of that, and I'm already very aware that this experience will push us and test us in many ways. Simply the fact that we'll find ourselves mainly stuck to one place all day long, just that in itself creates all sorts of opportunities for reflection. Let's call them that. And I'll give you an example. We have two young kids, 6 and 3 years old, and just yesterday morning when we were Skyping with my brother who lives in Austria, my youngest, who is 3 years old, managed to knock over a coffee mug over my external keyboard, which I was using because my laptop's keyboard is already malfunctioning. So I was not happy. I freaked out and I jumped up over him and I grabbed the keyboard and I started wiping it with paper towel and sort of swinging it around like a madman, like a human centrifuge, trying to get that water out of it. And all the while I'm doing this and jumping around and trying to dry and freaking out, I'm also making it very clear to him that I'm not happy with what just happened. And then of course a while later when I calmed down, then I found myself, as is only too familiar in the life of a father, I found myself no longer angry with him, but angry with myself for having been so angry with the 3-year-old for spilling coffee. So I called him, I sat him on my lap, and I said sorry for having spoken so angrily to him, and explained what was the problem with the situation, that he had to take care, and why spilling coffee on Daddy's laptop might drive Daddy a bit nuts. And that went well. He accepted well the lesson and the apology and went back to playing. But I stayed behind, sort of thinking that this close quarters sort of lockdown experience is bound to make us reflect on how we deal with each other and how we deal with ourselves. And what was clear for me from my experience with Ben that morning is that these things are profoundly connected. So as I thought about all of this stuff and the time we're in and what do I have to say, right? And I spent some time with the scriptures, and I was drawn almost inevitably to a passage which is a quite obvious passage, I think, for these days and for this reflection. But as I came to it, I actually found something there that I had not seen before in that way, and that's what I wanted to share with you today. So I want to invite you to read with me, and you can read it in your own home if you have a Bible there, or find it on your phone or something. And I'm going to read from the New International Version, from the Gospel according to St. Luke, chapter 10, and I'm going to read from verse 25 to 37. So Luke 10, 25 to 37. And this is how Luke tells us the story. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expenses you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. If you grew up in a Christian church or just a Christian environment around Christian people, chances are you've heard this parable dozens, if not hundreds of times. I certainly have. And the interpretation is usually quite straightforward, right? The commandment, love the Lord your God with all and love your neighbor as yourself. And then a question about who's my neighbor, and then Jesus tells a parable, and you go, oh, okay, so my neighbor is the guy by the roadside who is beaten down, who is in need, and I gotta be there for him, right? So, and that's a perfectly right reading, but what I hadn't noticed before was a little detail of language that suddenly made this whole parable a lot more complex and a lot more interesting, I think. And here's what I'm talking about. The commandment says, love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. And then the expert in the law asks, who is my neighbor? By which he's asking, whom am I to love? But in the end of the parable, Jesus asked, who was a neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of robbers? Now, why do I find that interesting? Because our usual reflex, I think, is to place the expert in the law who is questioning Jesus as one of the people who come along the road and ignore this man laying down half dead, right? But when I put this question from the expert in the law, who is my neighbor? And then Jesus' question in the end of the parable, who was a neighbor to the man? And I put these two side by side, who was my neighbor, who was a neighbor to, I see 2 inversions. First, suddenly the expert in the law is being put not in the place of those who come down the road, but in the place of the one who is beaten down, of the one in need of a neighbor. Who is my neighbor? Who was a neighbor to? And of course, this means, the second thing, that the neighbor is the one loving. So it seems like Jesus might be flipping his question on its head. The expert in the law's question, who is my neighbor, to try to excuse himself from showing love towards others. Jesus flips it over its head and puts him in the position of the one needing kindness and love, of the one needing to be loved. So which is it, right? Because still Jesus does use a Levite and a priest as the example, right? As examples of these who pass by and don't help. So it's only logical to assume that he's critiquing the expert in the law, and Luke himself says that he's trying to excuse himself, that he is critiquing him for passing by. So which is it? You know, is it the one in need is the one in need of help and of love, or in the one in need of showing love? Which is it? And I think it's both. It's both. Because loving and being loved are deeply interconnected. Loving the other and loving oneself are deeply interconnected as well. Who is my neighbor? He is yourself. He is the other, but he is also yourself. We are always self and other at the same time. Those in need of love and those who must love. And we always occupy these two things at the same time, even if we may be experiencing one more clearly than the other. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all. And love your neighbor as yourself. You could argue, love your neighbor as yourself. You could argue that those who bypassed the man on the side of the road were showing some sort of self-love, right? They were refusing to put themselves in a potentially dangerous situation and were keeping themselves safe, right? Isn't that how we often argue about self-love? But then when you are challenged to see yourself simultaneously on the position of the one considering if you should offer help, but also at the same time in the position of the one in need of help, then that whole idea of self-love that is centered on the self is shown to be selfishness. And we see that the commandment is not talking about a self-love that is centered on the self, but a self-love that is centered on love. The surface logic of this, which honestly I think is already a good enough reason for us to do something and to act in a certain way of the world, in a way quite independently of if you're a Christian or not, is the surface logic is that by contributing to a culture where people help each other, you increase your chances of getting help when you need it. Still a bit focused on yourself, but still it brings something good into the world, right? By contributing to a culture where we help each other when we're in need, that means that when we are in need, there's a bigger chance of us being helped. But the deeper sense of it that the parable is bringing us into here, however, is that these things are deeply interconnected. They belong to each other. We love because we are loved. Our very ability to love has to do with our receiving love, and this applies also to our self-love. In the narrative of the scriptures, we could say that as created beings, created in the image of God, we love ourselves because we are created by a loving God, and we are able to love because this God loved unto us so that we may love unto others. To say it differently, a child learns to love itself because it is loved by its parents or those who care for her. And that is also how they learn how to love and show love to others. And you will notice, by the way, that love here is very concrete, right? It's not about having a warm feeling for each other necessarily, but it's about caring, the actual sense of taking care of each other. It is expressed and it is embodied. It has texture, it has smell, it has presence. And for me, this is part of the genius of Jesus' parables, right? And of this parable. This both and character. Instead of sort of answering us with a do this and get that kind of answer, he gives us a parable that embraces the paradox and the ambiguity of our existence. And it tells us that we must love and that we must be loved. And at the same time, it gives us permission to be sort of somewhere along the journey. It doesn't necessarily expect us to have everything figured out. It gives us permission to find ourselves sometimes here and sometimes there, and yet gives us the word and the presence of Jesus helping us bring this all together. And it's a graceful permission, and it's a necessary reflection, I think, for these days in which we find ourselves having to take very concrete measures. And we might feel them as burdens or as opportunities to show love. We might feel them onerous or necessary and even merciful. And we'll find that this next few weeks can trigger different feelings and reactions in us. We may find ourselves afraid and unsure of what the future holds. And that may push us to put ourselves first and stockpile our pantries and shore up our defenses. Or we may suddenly find ourselves thinking about those who are more vulnerable and whom we usually are not much concerned with. But in these times, suddenly they come to the front and we think about them, and we might find ourselves confronted by the frailty of life, and perhaps that may trigger us into compassion, right? Perhaps we might find ourselves lonely and craving fellowship, or we might find it difficult to deal with ourselves when we are under pressure. Or perhaps we will find just how much we cherish our friends and our families and our dear ones. And this experience is almost like a microcosmos of the reality of our life, an intense experience of things that we experience throughout life. But in this, we find Jesus speaking into all of this through this parable today. And we find that the one telling the parable, and the parable that embraces this complexity of life, still he gives us a command, right? He says, go and do likewise. And he gives us a command, but he does more. He gives us a command, but he also gives us himself. He gives us himself so that being loved, we may love. He gives us each other. He gives us the very substance from which we may operate. His loving presence is with us. He is present in the acts of love and kindness. And the acts of love and kindness witness to his presence and feed and speak to us of his love for us and our love for him and our love for each other because of his presence with us. And that's a calling for today and for our lives, a calling that we may be his people, people who know ourselves loved and who love because we know ourselves loved, and in loving find out just the depth and the extent and the radicality of the love of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So let's do that. Let's be his people. The world needs it, and we need it. So have a great week, everyone. Tackle the challenges with courage and with grace, and let's keep in touch, pray for each other and encourage each other. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you. May the Lord turn his face towards each and every one of you and give you peace. Go in peace and serve the Lord joyfully. Have a great week.